Canon Puncture, episode 91. Game Advocates.
Say Game Advocates.
Game Advocates.
Game Advocates.
Game Advocates.
Game Advocates.
Game Advocates.
Good job. This episode of the Canon Puncture Show was recorded on February 25th, 2010. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Canon Puncture Show. This is Rich Rogers here, bringing you another one of our Game Advocates episodes. And on the line I have with me Jason Corley. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing excellent tonight. How about yourself?
Good, good. Now Jason is one of the co-hosts of Out of Character, so we've got a pulp gamer aficionado here, and he's also a writer from the Alpha Omega game and a longtime GM. So I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Well, it's great to be here. I like the Game Advocate series, and it's pretty cool.
All right. Well, it is your turn at bat, Jason. What are you going to advocate for today?
Well, I'm going to advocate for Vampire. The current edition of Vampire is called Vampire the Requiem. I am not one of those people that thinks that all of the different editions of Vampire are so different as to require, a completely different approach. So I see it as one long continuous string of Vampire games, core books, and supplements going all the way back to 1991. So that's what I'm here to talk about, Vampire.
So what is this Vampire game from 1991 you're talking about?
Well, it's published by White Wolf, and it's a game. It's a role-playing game with a GM and players each playing their own character. And the characters are vampires in a modern occult setting, in which one of the fundamental aspects of the setting is that the vampires must keep themselves hidden from humanity. They can't just rule over humanity openly. They have to hide away and make sure that humanity doesn't know of their existence. It's a very political game in terms of the various characters have to balance their own desires for power and control and secrecy against what they're willing to do to obtain it. It also has its roots in the vampire fiction of Anne Rice, and a little bit older, but really it has kind of a very modern day sensibility to it versus, say, a Victorian idea of what a vampire is. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much the game.
So what makes Vampire different?
Well, what I think made it different when I first came across it wasn't the first time where the players were playing essentially monsters. There had been other games that were in existence where you played monsters. There was Tunnels and Trolls. There was even another horror game that came out around the same time called Nightlife. But Vampire was the first game that I ever saw in which they actually made the monstrousness of the characters explicitly part of the system, and used the language of fiction in order to get across what the game was about. They made some cosmetic changes, calling the game master a storyteller, for example. But they also had some very story-oriented suggestions for how to make your game come alive as fiction. For example, the use of themes and tones. These are just real basic sort of 8th grade English ideas that you can impose on your story, and that, in fact, GMs were required to. You could pick a theme such as, what will we do for power, or, family ties are the strongest ties, or something like that, and work that into the events, antagonists, and so on of the game. And then you picked a tone that you would use to color your descriptions of what was happening, the characters, the locations, and so on. By doing that, they provided some very, very basic organizational tools that let GMs really paint with a different sort of brush than they had been encouraged to do so before. So that was what made it different. Now, Vampire's been around since 1991, and it's been probably one of the biggest hit games. So the things that it did have been imitated and have influenced other games over the many years since it came out. So it a lot of the things that made it innovative at the time have really propagated into the rest of gaming. So it's not quite as unique today as it was back then.
In this game of Vampire, you talked about all the tools that the game master, the storyteller, has. But what's the subject of the game at the table? What are the players doing?
That's a great question, and I think that one of the weaknesses of Vampire and of the White Wolf games in general is that you really don't know what a particular game is going to be until the campaign is designed. In other words, you can have a game of Vampire that is fangs and trenchcoat superheroes. In fact, some of the very early adventures that were published for Vampire were essentially dungeon crawls, complete with an ancient temple with a treasure at the end. And other potential campaigns could be much more political, in which the characters are movers and shakers in the city and have minions and try to handle their situation. Others could be more personal, could have to do with the characters' families and trying to protect their mortal loved ones while they themselves were increasingly drawn into a monstrous immortal society. So it really is up to the GM and players what it's about in terms of the actual subject matter. The fundamental core of a Vampire game, though, is the characters have been brought into this horrific world and out of the world of mortals. And as a result, have to face the loss of their humanity as they, deal with the situations and issues of this new world. So that is sort of the core story. What actually happens at the table plot wise and what the characters do in reaction to it, that really is going to depend on the individual campaign. I see that as a great strength. It's a bit of a toolkit game. Other people see it as, well, the game may not have as strong a center as other games might. It's not quite as focused.
You're describing some of the aspects of Vampire, but why wouldn't I want to play, some other horror game like maybe Call of Cthulhu?
Well, what's interesting about Vampire compared to other horror games is, first of all, you're on the inside of the horror in Vampire for the most part. There may be other horrific things happening in the world, but there's just as much terror in the fact that you have to go out and drink human blood in order to survive, as there is in discovering that there might be a ghost that exists as well. So Vampire is really a game about horror from the inside, whereas Call of Cthulhu, you're not a cultist, and you're certainly not like a deep one or an old one, at least as far as you know. And you are experiencing the horror as an ordinary person would, as being from the outside. Now, there's nothing wrong with that at all. I love Call of Cthulhu, and I love more investigatory horror games where you're trying to figure out what terrible thing is going on. Vampire, at least the central aspect of the game, is about you yourself being the horror, other mortals being justly scared of what you are, if they should ever find out about it, and having to hide and try to appear normal in order to keep from being revealed. In other words, in Call of Cthulhu, you're trying to reveal the horror that exists. In Vampire, you're trying to conceal it, cover it up, bury it, make sure that no one ever sees it, against all of the forces in the world that are trying to bring it to the surface. So it's sort of the opposite. It's kind of an inside-out version. That gives it some tension, and I think we've seen an explosion of vampire and supernatural literature and pulp fiction and romances and so on that exploit that tension of having to keep a secret, and keeping that secret is really what Vampire is all about.
So let's say you've twisted my arm and brought me to the table to play a game of Vampire.
And I put the bike helmet on you to prevent brain damage. That joke is going to get old someday, but that day ain't here yet.
Okay, so I've got my bike helmet on. I'm sitting down at the table with you. I've never played this before. What would you warn me about?
As far as warning you about, obviously, the first and foremost thing is that although you're going to have a lot of cool powers, and that's one of the great things about the game, is that when you read through the powers that vampires have, very few of them are lame. Most of them, you look at them and go, oh yeah, I want to do that. I want to be that guy. I want to be able to turn invisible in a room full of people, or turn into a bat, or, have super strength, or, compel people by looking into their eyes. Although you're going to have that a great deal more power than a typical mortal character might, certainly in a Call of Cthulhu game, in other horror games, your powerlessness against terror is emphasized. In Vampire, you start out pretty powerful. In certain editions, you could start out, I think, a little too powerful almost. But there's always going to be something bigger than you. There's always going to be something more powerful than you out there that you have to deal with, and you can react to it emotionally any way you want, but I don't want you to feel like I'm cheating when I bring out something in the world that's more evil and more terrible and more frightening than you are. So that's one thing that I would get at. Another thing I would get at pretty early on is that the White Wolf system, at least as it exists today, is set up so that most average people doing most average things are going to succeed to a small degree. So don't feel like if you want a character that, if you want them to be knowledgeable, say, for example, you don't have to over specialize and put all of your character creation resources into making them super knowledgeable. If you just want them to be kind of smart, you can put a few points into it, and just go from there. And that's a trap that can happen in character creation. I do have to say, in favor of Vampire, as far as early bringing in new people go, it was one of the first games in a long time in 1991, and maybe the first game in a long time since the last game in a long time since then, to bring in a lot of people that had never role-played before. And part of that, I'm sure, is cultural as to what was popular in 1991. But certainly a big part of it is that you can pick up the book, be enthralled with the particular kind of character concept, and then sit down and play it pretty promptly and easily. And I think, that's pretty much what I'd warn you about, is that there's always something bigger out there, and don't worry too much about making a big mistake in character creation. It's pretty forgiving.
What is it that you see other players loving about the game when they play?
Well, like I say, I've been doing this a long time. And in 1991, I think the first thing that I loved about it was we kind of ran it like D&D at first, because, like I say, those first adventures were sort of D&D style, and that was all we had played before. The only difference was now there were girls in our group. So believe me, that when they said, hey, we're interested in playing this vampire game, we switched games in a hurry. We were just, and this was at a time in my life when I was just getting interested in girls. So this was a perfect match for me. Anyway, so we go in and we start playing, and we played through a couple of these, and we went through the dungeon crawl, and we fought the end boss, and we got the treasure, and then we did it again. And I had been reading the rule book, and I noticed something, which was that the rule book said that the vampire who deceives the most, who is the most deceptive and who can lie and be silver-tongued and be, very socially adept, is often going to be on top of and controlling those that have more physical power. Well, I said, okay, I'll give that a try. And the next dungeon crawl we went on, we went through the dungeon, we killed the end boss, we got the treasure. I said, I'll carry it. And I took it, and then I dynamited the rest of the party on the way out, got a total party kill, returned to civilization and said that unfortunately the end boss had killed them. And the GM read the same rules that I did and said, oh, well, he's more deceptive, so therefore he wins. He gets the treasure. And so I did that a couple of times, including not just that one total party kill, but 2 by me. And then people figured it out. They're like, wait a second, this isn't D&D. This isn't a situation where the strongest guy in the room is always going to win. This is a game where you can succeed by your cunning, and the game supports your cunning. And once we had that, the next group of characters that went out were the most backstabbing, treacherous group of snakes that you could ever hope to see. And it was delicious. It was just wonderful to watch them go at this common problem that they knew they had to solve, but they all were just looking for any advantage over each other. It put a great tension at the table. So that's the first thing, is that players love to have their cunning rewarded. And this game really rewards cunning. And I would say that I already mentioned the really compelling supernatural powers. White Wolf is great at writing cool powers that people want to have. I ran a live action version of Vampire here in Tucson for about 5.5 years. And there I saw people really like the idea of identifying very strongly with a character who is not someone who lives in a faraway kingdom in an imaginary world. They live right here. They live in your town. They look like you. They, in fact, do their very best to try to be like you, but they are not like you. They have something in them that's different. And so that, for some reason, really makes people identify with these characters and really become strongly attached to them and really advocate for them strongly. And that's a great strength of this game. So I think those are the areas that I've seen people really get attached to.
We average 9 new titles a day. That's over 60 a week. And we've got well over 15,000 RPG titles online right now. Drive-Thru RPG, the one true source for RPGs.
Well, what are some of your favorite moments at the table?
I'll tell a couple of little quick stories. One is from a LARP, and I think I've even posted this one on Story Games before. This LARP that we had a set of stock characters. And basically we had sat down one day and written, 50 vampire characters in their system, typed them all up, printed them all out. And so if anyone showed up to the game and didn't have a character, we always had one ready that they could take and just say, well, here's a 1-sentence precis on this character. Here's your stats. Play tonight. If you like it, come back early next time and we'll make a character with you. We had a pretty low-power LARP as things go. We were in the city of Tucson, which is a very small city, and we didn't feel like we wanted to have, like, a mega powerful vampire is not going to come to Tucson to set up shop. They're going to be in charge of New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. They're going to be in charge of some big, important city somewhere. They're not going to come here. So we had some different rules as to, how to keep the game sort of low-powered in terms of you could still become a very powerful character, but there was sort of a cap. Eventually, you were not going to get any more powerful because it would just be unrealistic for the LARP. And so we would have people come in and ask to play incredibly powerful characters. And we had to figure out some way to handle their request. So we had what we called an inoculation. And this was in which a guy would come in and say, I want to play, an extremely powerful vampire, and maybe he's got some werewolf powers or some mage powers from elsewhere in the world of darkness, and I just want to play someone that, that powerful. We're thinking, we could either be boring and say, well, that would be 50 times powerful than the most powerful character in the game, and we're not going to do that, which he would get upset at and say, oh no, these guys are bums. Or what we always did was we basically lied straight to their face and said, oh, well, we've already handed out all those characters. Okay. All of those super powerful characters are already out there. But basically we said, Jesus is already being played. Would you like to play Merlin? And so we had a kid at a LARP. He was probably about 17, and this was at a con here in town at TusCon, and we gave him that spiel and said, well, would you like to play Merlin? And he said, sure. Now, we really had was a character named Ambrose, and Ambrose had a derangement, which is a piece of insanity that you can get from being a vampire. And his derangement was that he believed himself to be the reincarnation of the most powerful mage in the world. And he actually had no occult skill. He had zero. He had no occult powers. All of his powers were things like, compelling people to do things when he looked at them and things of that sort, vampire type powers, but nothing like magical. And so we gave him his packet, and he looked at it, and he's expecting, I want a guy with lots of magic powers. My character packet's going to be like 20 pages long. And this is one page. It's a one sheet. And he's looking at it, and I was watching him before the game to see if he was going to get mad, like sometimes we had them do. And he looked at it, and finally I saw the light bulb go on. He got it. He understood. So he smiled. He folded up his character sheet. We had our first little, meeting of a LARP where everyone's together in one place. We kind of give them the problem. And he strode right up to the occult knowledgeable characters. And there were 3 of them, and they were in a little coterie together, a little sort of group of vampires that are going to work together. And he introduces himself, and he says that he is one of the world's foremost experts on matters occult, and he would be happy to provide them with the benefit of his assistance. and he's so smooth with them that they're like, oh, okay, this guy must have another occult powerful character. Let's bring him along into our group. So off he goes, and I can overhear, I'm GMing this game with a few other people, so I'm not everywhere at any particular time. I can overhear this kid, occasionally saying something that sounds kind of good, but at the same time is total nonsense. It's just completely made up. And the other characters, he's delivering it with such confidence and such, calm assuredness that the other characters are like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We'll do that. Okay. Oh, yeah, all right. So he has them completely snowed. And naturally he's associating with them. Other characters know that those characters are good at the occult, so they assume this guy is now getting their credibility on top of everything else. One of the plot points in the game was that there were some ashes that were found in a hotel room. These ashes were the ashes of a vampire who had been killed. And the question was, are they the prince's ashes? And everyone was concerned about how to prove, yes, they're the prince's ashes, or no, they're not the prince's ashes. So I'm up there, I'm the GM, I'm adjudicating the scene, and I'm, people are making the tests, and I'm answering the questions, and everyone's arguing over what to do. And finally, Ambrose steps to the fore, and he, raises his hands, both hands high into the air, and people kind of get quiet, and he says, I can perform a magical ritual which will determine if these are the prince's ashes. Please give me the bag. So they give him the bag in which are the ashes, and he says, this ritual requires privacy. He goes into the hotel bathroom. We're in a hotel room at a con. He closes the door and locks it. And we begin to hear softly from inside the room, this chanting. And I don't know if it was Pig Latin or what it was, but it was just this long syllables and just sounded so good. This guy's really doing an occult ritual in there, and it's getting louder and louder and louder, and until he's screaming at the top of his lungs, and then there's a pause and flush. We hear the toilet go as the ashes that they've all been arguing over for 40 minutes are flushed down this toilet. The room goes crazy. I mean, every character in the room is yelling and screaming and jumping up. And there's the GM, and I'm laughing so hard. I'm crying. I can't even adjudicate anything at this point. And he's still going inside the bathroom. He's still screaming at the top of his lungs and flushing and flushing and flushing. And finally, I managed to pull it together enough that one of the characters who was closest to the bathroom is telling me, I break down the door. So I walk up to the door to knock on it and tell him that this guy, this huge, humongous vampire with super strength, has just punched down the door. And the door opens. And he comes striding out. The bag is now empty, gone. And he looks at this huge, angry guy, and everyone is still screaming at him. And he looks at them with total calmness, just complete confidence. And he says, "Excuse me, the ritual is not complete." He goes over to the hotel faucet. He turns on the faucet, leans over it. Everyone is still yelling. He says, "I'm sorry, you'll have to be quiet. I'm listening to the water spirits." And he listens to the faucet for a minute. And then he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the ashes belonged to the prince. I am happy to have been of service." And he walks out of the room. And I'm dying. He was right. Okay. Right. I never told him anything. But he figures, hey, my guy's got a 50-50 chance. And he knows he can do this. So he just called it and walked out. And what was funny was, even after he did that, there were people in that room that still believed in him. Like, they still believed that this guy had some ability. So that kid joined our LARP, and he made a character at the right power level. He understood what our LARP was about at that point, because he had this character that was so much fun.
Wow.
What is great about that story is it again shows that cunning or even just brazen social confidence can really get you somewhere in that game. I'm trying to think of a tabletop story. A lot of times my games ended up being kind of funny. And I think everyone that's played a horror game knows that the things that make you scared are the same things that make you laugh. Something unexpected, or out of place. It can scare you or it can make you laugh, or both. So I think everyone that plays horror games, you're laughing at various points in the game. One of the things that I like about Vampire is you can switch gears very fast. And you can go from yucking it up to, oh my God, what did I just do? As sort of unintended consequences follow. I can't think of any really terrific tabletop ones right now, but I'll mention this because this is an interesting cultural one. This was actually pretty recently. I wanted to try out Vampire the Requiem system because I hadn't had a chance to do it yet. Requiem is the latest edition of Vampire. I was playing a game set in Poland in the late 18th century during the time it was partitioned between the various nations of Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. I said, I kind of, want you guys to be troubleshooters. The concept of the game is I want you guys to be people who other vampires come to with difficult problems, and you go in and solve them as best you can. Pretty much a mission-based game, because it was mainly to try out different aspects of the system. So we do a social problem, and then we do like a problem that was solved by combat, and kind of artificial and kind of cliche, but what the heck, that was the purpose of the game. So my wife and her best friend and my best friend all made characters for it. And the idea was my wife and her best friend made vampire characters who did all of the actual work. And my best friend made a character who was the face man, and who the other two characters had sort of invented and built up into this imposing figure by spreading rumors about him and lying about him. And, and then eventually people are like, well, where is this guy that's so amazing that we have to do what you say? And they didn't have anyone to produce until this dude showed up. So he sort of took over that identity. And so we went along and, we were working on getting the game started. And I said, guys, you do realize that we just replicated the plot of Remington's Steel. And as soon as we had that in mind, we had the concept of the game in mind, and it worked really well.
Nice.
But it was a good time.
It sounds like there are a lot of people who've had fun with the game. Why is it that people hate Vampire as the role-playing game?
One of the most common complaints I've seen about it, and I've been yelling about White Wolf games on forums for an embarrassing amount of years, is that a lot of White Wolf games, not so as much anymore, but it's still there a little bit, they have a bit of a section in it where they compare it to other role-playing games, and the other role-playing games are not compared favorably. Basically, they say, hey, here's our game, and it's much, much, much better than those other games that are out there. And some people see that as off-putting. And to be honest, it's marketing. It's in-book marketing, and I don't see it as very effective. But then again, I'm not a marketer because I still have at least a part of a soul that is left to me. Oh, ouch! Yes, he went there. But so that's one thing, is that it has a specific tone, and it pushes a particular tone towards the reader, and some people just don't like that tone. Another thing is that early on in the system of Vampire was a little bit, it was not particularly strong. And that's in some cases being very generous. There are certain areas where it was just flat broken. People who want a very rigorous sort of balance between character capabilities in the game are probably not going to have that desire rewarded by Vampire. It's also a game that has been criticized for being, at least for the longest time, for being very vague about how it interacted with White Wolf's other games. And people wanted to combine all of the other games that were in the same World of Darkness line for, 20 years at least. And they were always very coy about how it could be done. I think in part because they knew that the game balance was not the greatest within a game line. And if you started trying to incorporate other game lines, it would just quickly spiral out of control. And it was bad to start with, but it would have been 1,000 times worse if they'd gone elsewhere. So I think people wanted some things from Vampire that it could not provide. The last criticism, and this is one that I've had for a long time and it really even still hasn't been fully addressed, is there's a humanity system in Vampire. And what I mean by that is there's a stat called humanity, and as you do evil deeds and fail to either show sufficient remorse or make sufficient amends, this statistic, this number falls. And if you do make enough amends or remorse, it rises or maintains its level. And it's a pretty amazing narrative tool. You can get characters into all kinds of situations by making it, as with all Vampire stories, you can gain power much easier and much faster if you use your vampiric abilities to harm people, to take over their minds, to kill your enemies, and so on, than you can if you're just trying to manipulate them and be sort of a peaceful person. So it's got a great vice aspect to it. You're putting them into a vice and closing it tighter and tighter. The problem is there's not much ideas in any of the books for how to make that happen. There's a lot of examples as to really depraved vampires and really terrible things that happen when their humanity levels fall very low, but players don't identify with those. They don't see those as being viable things for their character to do, so they're never really tempted by them. For something that requires that they give in to temptation, or at least feel the temptation or identify with their character's temptation, there's very little direct advice for how to accomplish that. And I'd say probably the final criticism is because the GM sets the theme and tone of the game and has such enormous control over the material and the content that goes in, a character that is perfectly suitable for one game may be absolutely wrong in every way for another. So each game of Vampire is a unique and special snowflake, and the one that you get may end up being awful. And the one next door may be exactly what you're looking for if you but only knew that that's what they were playing. So I would say that those are the main criticisms that I've heard over the years.
Interesting. Is there anything else about Vampire the role-playing game you want to talk about?
It's branched out into a number of properties. Like there's a card game. There was actually several card games. First a collectible one. Now there's one that is more of a complete card game. There's a very complicated board game that's out. It's really become a property that's sort of spread beyond its roots. And I think a lot of people sort of take it for granted that, Vampire, it's a big popular game. It's pretty much exactly like D&D. It's pretty much exactly like your normal traditional role-playing game, but really it has a lot of strengths, and they've managed to keep from throwing them away through 4 different editions, which if you think about it, that's pretty hard to do. To have 4 editions of something and not screw it up really, really badly, that's just difficult. And so I think it's a real accomplishment. So I think that's pretty much it.
Jason, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with us about Vampire.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks.
We had such potential, such promise.